Welcome to the AWIP podcast. I'm your host, Rae Smith. Here we focus on investigations and all things animal welfare related. We're bringing you in-depth conversations each week with animal welfare professionals from around the globe. So make sure that you check us out on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. And of course, if you want to learn any more information about AWIP and our mission, make sure that you check us out at either of our web pages, awip.org.uk or at awipusa.org. So I was having a discussion with some of my work colleagues the other day, and it's kind of a convenient time that it came up because of the episode we're doing today. And we were debating on what the most abused type of animal is. And the most prominent answer was cats, which I thought was kind of interesting because it makes sense for some disciplines to think that. But then, I got reminded about the episode that we're doing today, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this. And so my argument was, not just chickens in particular, but farm animals in general. And once I said that, people were kind of like, but then they got it and they were like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I'm really excited for this episode today because, we so commonly talk about animal welfare issues pertaining to cats and dogs. And we tend to leave out farm animals. So my guest for today is Isabella Nilsson. She's an Equal Justice Works Fellow for the Legal Impact for Chickens. Isabella, how are you? Thank you for coming on.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much, Rae, and thank you to AWIP and to you for having me this morning.
Of
I'm really
course.
excited to chat with you. So thanks for having me and for having Lick on.
I'm interested to hear. I mean, I always love talking to lawyers to figure out how they ended up getting into the animal welfare world because there's like so many different paths that you guys can choose from. How did you get into animal welfare and where you are today with Legal Impact?
Yeah, so as a kid, I think like many children, I really loved animals. I loved reading about animals. I was really fascinated by them. And actually, for a while as a kid, I was vegetarian. I think that it's interesting because we don't really talk about it as a society, but I think that for a lot of children, there's a kind of moment of disillusionment when they realize where the food they're eating is actually coming from, because so many of the books they're reading have to do with, cows and chickens and sheep, and they have a real love for these animals. And then there's a kind of difficult moment when they realize that what they're eating is actually these animals that they care about and are sort of intrigued by. So I was kind of shocked by that as a kid and went vegetarian for a few years and then kind of moved away from that. And then as a high schooler, I read a book by the philosopher Peter Singer called Animal Liberation. And yeah, you're nodding, so maybe you've read it too. And
Yep.
I just found it to be so clear, so convincing in a way I hadn't experienced with any kind of philosophical book before. And I was really moved by it. So I decided I wanted to go vegetarian again. And in college, I was an English and creative writing major. I really loved writing. That was another passion of mine. And so when I graduated, I tried to think about what could allow me to combine sort of my interest in social change, wanting to make the world a better place, but also this interest in writing that I had. So I ended up thinking that law school might be a good route. I applied. I was in law school, and while I was there, I was fortunate enough to be at Harvard, which has a really fantastic animal law program, which you don't see at every law school, but we had a clinic, we had an actual program with visiting research fellows and that kind of thing. And it seemed like a really ignored area of the law in comparison to a lot of other areas. There weren't a lot of lawyers that were working on it, especially in the case of farmed animals. And of those that were working on it, a lot of them were at the university. So I thought, oh, here's an area where I can go back to this love of animals I've had my whole life, but also really make a positive change as one person, because so few of us are are trying to tackle this issue. So I reached out to Legal Impact for Chickens. I knew of Aline. She was like I think a 2016 law school grad, and um, the organization was born through a seed grant from Harvard's public service wing. And so I reached out and I said, "Hey, I'd love to work for you. If I get a fellowship, is that something that we could partner on?" And I told her that I was especially interested in the intersection of animal rights and worker rights, because actually, if you look at the factory farming system, it's not just abusing animals, but in my opinion, it's really abusing workers as well. It's some of the most disenfranchised workers in our entire sort of industry or economy. And she said, "Yeah, that sounds wonderful." And yeah, I was fortunate enough to be able to be named an Equal Justice Works Fellow and come aboard after graduating this spring and officially join in the summer. So yeah, it's been like a pretty thrilling few months, and I'm really excited about the work we're doing and the change we're trying to make. So
And I thought I saw a post the other day that you had just recently passed your bar in
I
California.
did, yeah. So I took the California bar. Thank
Congratulations.
you. Took that in July, and that's it's 2 days, and it's pretty intense process. So you have to wait till November to hear how you did. And I was pretty relieved. I didn't want to start the studying process all over again. So now I'm officially licensed to practice law in California, which is fantastic.
Well,
Yes.
congratulations. I can't even imagine taking that test. It's like really huge. I'd flunk it. I wouldn't be able
I'm
to.
I'm sure you wouldn't, but yeah, it's about 2 months of just straight studying. You never want to see a flashcard in your life again. So yeah, I was glad to be through that crucible. Yes.
So talk about the work that Legal Impact for Chickens does and what their mission is.
Yeah. So put in simple terms, basically our mission is to make animal cruelty illegal, something that companies are held legally liable for. And we're especially interested in essentially prosecuting criminal crimes like animal cruelty, but using civil remedies, mostly because it's an area that we feel equipped to work on, and also an area in which we feel like we could make a lot of positive change. So, for instance, one of our first lawsuits, which was against Costco, basically was something that we call a shareholder derivative suit. It's basically when a shareholder of the company says, "Hey, um, what you're doing is illegal, and because of that, it's actually hurting the company, because you could be prosecuted for it. It's not something that's allowed." And this is something we thought was a great idea to apply to the animal rights context and animal law context, because unfortunately, there are rules on the books to protect factory farmed animals, but in a lot of cases, they're not being applied. And so we're very interested in thinking about um, routes through which we can make sure that those laws are being applied equally to all animals, since we believe that all animals are capable of pain, capable of suffering, and deserve the right to live lives that are as free of suffering as we can make them. I know that we care so much about our companion animals, and I have a dog that I love so much, and it's tough to imagine that I think there's almost a billion companion animals in the United States, but there's almost 10 billion farmed animals. And so it's tough to imagine that there's all these pigs and cows and chickens that, unfortunately, because of economic reasons, live lives that are really full of pain and suffering. And I think the average American, unfortunately, is not given the opportunity to see a lot of that. It's kept pretty in the closet. So our job is kind of just to bring that to light and to try and advance welfare for farmed animals across the United States in the work we do and in the lawsuits we bring.
Now, and you talked a little bit earlier about the intersection of animal welfare and worker welfare, which I think is interesting because when we get into talking about farmed animals, rightfully, I would say, we focus on the animals themselves and the pain and suffering that they go through for their, you know, relatively short lives compared to how long they can actually live for. But I think it's interesting because it's kind of a reflection of the way that we view animals in that space, in the agricultural industry, and how these workers are also treated in that space as well. And so, can you kind of talk about the conditions that both that the animals live through, in general terms, and then those conditions that the workers also go through on these farms?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely pretty distressing to learn about, and it's quite interesting that you see this intersection of disenfranchisement, not just for the animals, but for the workers as well in this industry. So we could just take poultry for an example. Um, if you start at the beginning of a chicken's life, we have a system in this country, in the United States, where essentially people who have no prior experience farming generally are offered contracts by large poultry corporations, for instance, Purdue or Tyson, to raise um, over time millions of chickens. And it's almost a lot of people have argued that even though they're labeled contractors, which means the company doesn't need to provide them any kind of legal protections or employment protections as they would employees, they would more properly be considered employees because they're raising one company's chickens generally. They usually will go into debt to build um, barns specifically to the company's specifications. And the company is free to essentially cut off business with them at any time if the farmer is doing something that the company doesn't like, or raising the chickens in a way that goes away from the company's specifications, which usually are to essentially raise them as quickly and cheaply as possible. So these chicks start their lives in very crowded conditions in airless barns where they never get to see light. They never get to go outside. A lot of the times they grow so quickly that their legs will break under them and they can't walk. They often will have sores on their bodies. If one chicken is sick, usually it doesn't receive veterinary care. Often the chickens are debeaked because they're so distressed that otherwise they would bite, peck at each other. So instead, they're mutilated, their beaks are cut off, and they live lives that really are full of a lot of suffering. The farmers that are taking care of them often try to do their best, but there's only so much they can do within sort of the limits of what's permitted by the company. And often they don't have experience in animal husbandry, and this is something that's new to them. Um, so after a period of weeks, the chickens are caught by what is called chicken catchers. It's not always the same, but in a lot of instances, um, there's a really fascinating book that came out recently called Life and Death of the American Worker by Alice Driver. It's a really fascinating book. I definitely recommend it to your listeners. And something that she talks about seeing in Arkansas, where there's a lot of Tyson, um, what we call grower houses and then slaughterhouses, is young miners, often 14 or 15 years old, often undocumented immigrants, working as chicken catchers. And they'll be given 12 hours to clear an entire barn of thousands of chickens. They'll have one shift. So they're working really quickly. They don't have protective equipment. They often don't have masks. They're breathing in all the ammonia that the chickens produce, which is actually poisonous to humans. And they're getting cut and scratched by the chickens. And obviously, it's really distressing for the chickens as well. They're being grabbed without any kind of protective equipment. Often their legs are broken. Then they're taken to the slaughterhouses. And unfortunately, we see a lot of instances in the slaughterhouses where the line speeds are just so quick that it's very difficult for workers to keep up. It causes a lot of carpal tunnel. That's very common in the industry. Often workers aren't being given appropriate protective equipment, or it's not the correct size. So we see a lot of issues with workers cutting themselves with knives on accident as they're trying to keep up with the speed of the line. There's been a lot of studies coming out that show PTSD, depression among workers because of the nature of the work they're doing. Often it's really difficult to get things like bathroom breaks because supervisors are so reluctant to stop the line. So if you don't have a replacement handy, you can't go to the bathroom, or it's difficult to get the time to do so. And then the fast line speeds are also really difficult for the chickens because essentially the workers are trying to shackle them by the legs upside down while the chickens are still totally conscious and not sedated or anything at a speed of a chicken a second. So it's just so quick that a lot of the time they might not be shackled properly or they have to be handled roughly. And then if anything goes wrong, you'll see instances where essentially, if everything goes right, the chickens are um, stunned in an electric water bath and then have their throats slit before they're scalded. But if anything goes wrong with the line, you end up in a situation where the chickens are actually scalded alive. And we know that that happens for many of them. If you think about, um, I don't know the exact figures, but thousands and thousands of chickens every shift, a small percentage of them are actually being scalded alive. So um, it's a really tough environment for the workers who often are not being given adequate medical care. Their injuries may not be being reported to OSHA. They're not paid very well. Often they endure a lot of verbal abuse from supervisors. Um, and also, it's a really tough environment for the birds as well. And definitely could be done in a way that's more humane. In Europe and in some plants, they use a process called controlled atmospheric stunning, which is essentially using gas to knock the chickens out before they're slaughtered. But because it costs a little bit more to implement than the current system of what we call live hang, where the chickens are shackled alive by the legs and then go through the process we talked about, a lot of plants here just haven't implemented it. So it's tough to see these practices that would be pennies on the dollar and sometimes even save the company's money long term that just don't get implemented because it doesn't make sense economically immediately. And Yeah, it's a pretty dark and tough process. And I think if more Americans knew about it, they certainly would want some kind of change for the animals and absolutely for the workers as well. So
Yeah, I mean, it's really horrific. I know, I've never been to a plant before myself, but I feel
yeah,
like with the many videos, undercover investigations, all that, you get, it's hard to watch, it's really hard to watch the entire process. And I remember watching a documentary. I can't remember the name of it now, but that it included and talked about the lives of these people. And I know that there was a recent study that came out earlier this year that talked about the lives of these workers in slaughterhouses and such, and the like the sheer volume of them that develop depression,
yeah,
and that ultimately, if they're lucky enough to be able to leave the industry because it's so emotionally challenging for them, it's that they, sometimes didn't quite understand what they would be doing, what they would see, what they'd hear, what they'd experience. It's very similar to somebody going into the animal welfare field in any other, different area of expertise, is just like the constant exposure to suffering and pain and, these horrible things. It really is, it kind of makes you think about the companies that are, doing this, that value the profits and doing everything as economically as possible so that they can, it's all about money, right? Is what it comes down to, is
yeah,
produce it. It's sad, that funds and producing these products, these animal products, as cheaply as possible, um, always seems to take precedent over the welfare of the animals and the people.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And what can be so frustrating is when sometimes a change would only be cents on the dollar, but it would be so much better for the animals and for the workers as well. And because of the numbers we're talking about, I think billions of farmed animals, especially poultry, are being slaughtered every year. And just one really small change could make such a difference. But often, if it doesn't impact the bottom line, and or if corporations aren't getting a lot of public pushback, mostly because they make it very difficult for the public to know what's actually going on inside, they end up not changing anything, even
Yeah.
if the current practices, dehumanize the workers that work there and cause a lot of suffering for the animals that we consume as well. So it's tough, and I completely feel you on, I think there's a lot of burnout in the community of us who decide to go into this work and decide to advocate for the welfare of animals, because we do it because we care, but then inevitably it ends up meaning that we see a lot of the suffering that distresses us so much because we do care. So um, Aline, our founder, is always really wonderful about encouraging us to take the time we need, especially if we're reviewing difficult footage or working on something that is really graphic or just tough emotionally, to remind us to, take a step and take care of ourselves, because we can't continue doing the work we're doing if we don't um, take care of ourselves too. So
I think over time there's been a little bit more exposure and understanding about the USDA and what their standards are for animal care, under the Animal Welfare Act. It's not great. Not everybody knows it and knows the intricacies of the AWA. But I feel like over time, more people, learn about the USDA and, more so, I would say, um, the lack thereof, the motivation to improve these standards. And it's a lot of times left up to the states. And so we've seen, legislation with California and Colorado and other states that um, start enacting these changes to, animal welfare policies. So I know in California there was the whole thing about, gestation crates for swine and space for them. In Colorado, there's the new change, I think this year, um, where chickens are no longer allowed to be caged. They have to be cage free, which I know we'll get into because it's not exactly what it sounds like. But there are progressively minor changes that come about, but when you think of it overall, the standards of care in animal welfare, particularly for these farmed animals, really is not up to par with what maybe you and I, other advocates, would, advocate for as a basic standard. Why is that so hard to achieve better animal welfare standards in the industrial agricultural world?
yeah, what you said is really right. It's really kind of unfortunate when you think about how few federal laws actually have to do with farmed animal welfare. I think the average American would just assume that this is something that the government is regulating because so many billions of farmed animals are killed each year. But actually, there's only one federal law that actually governs cruelty to farmed animals and the slaughtering process. It's called the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. And actually, shockingly, as it's currently interpreted, it's not interpreted to apply to poultry. So the only law we have that was passed by Congress, I think in the 1950s, with the intent of making the slaughter process more humane, has not been, the term livestock in that law has not been interpreted to apply to poultry, even though the figure is something like for every cow that is killed for meat, 600 chickens are killed. So the animal that we're actually um, consuming in the highest numbers is the only one that actually isn't covered under that law. And then when you look at, well, what about where the animals spend most of their lives? What about conditions in the grower barns that we talked about, for instance? There's actually no federal law covering animal welfare in the context of the factory farm. There's the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and then there's also an act known as the 28-hour law that has to do with transportation, but there's really no federal laws specifically aimed at animal welfare on the farm, which is kind of shocking. So it's exactly what you said. I think that as a firm, we're most optimistic about sort of state laws, and we have seen some progress in that regard. You talked about California's Prop 12, which was a real step forward for pigs. You know, mother pigs are no longer allowed in California to be sold that have been kept in gestation crates, which are, I'm sure you know, but just for the listeners, effectively crates that are so small that they don't allow them to even turn around, and they're kept in those crates for much of their lives. And as we know, pigs are really sensitive, intelligent animals, just as intelligent, if not more so, than dogs. So it's pretty horrifying to think about their lives spent in those conditions. So that was really encouraging. And one of our lawsuits, our Case Farms lawsuit, we focused on a really wonderful North Carolina law called 19A, which basically allows you to sue in instances of animal cruelty for all animals, including animals in the agricultural context. And that's our interpretation of it. And that's been really exciting to see. So I think that unfortunately at this time we're really looking at state-based measures, and then also just trying to keep the public informed. And because the companies do really care what consumers think, they really care about what the public thinks about, you know, their product. And so often, interestingly, like the most change doesn't just come from, you know, lawsuits. It also comes from just public campaigns, public pressure, consumers saying, we really don't want to consume this. We would like to you know, have a product that's more ethical. And corporations really do listen to that. And you're seeing it. A lot of fast food chains have the Impossible Burger now. You're seeing a lot more vegan options just in public spaces, and that's because the consumer is asking for that. So we actually have a lot of power as consumers to change the way these corporations act.
So do you think it really just ends up coming down to educating the public on what these standards are, what they could be, what they lack, and then, you know, kind of almost framing it in a, you know, in a negative light that influences public opinion to say like, well, you know, we want change. This is not, this is not something that I want to support. Or is it, you know, changing, creating and changing state laws? I mean, what do you see in your line of work as what, like how we can change the industrial agriculture for the better?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think that as citizens, telling our lawmakers that this is something that really matters to us is really important. Because legislators do listen to what their constituents think. And if they're hearing from a lot of their constituents that um, they're really concerned about factory farming, they're concerned about the meat that they're consuming, they're worried about animal welfare, then that will be reflected in what legislators pass. There's an annual farm bill that has to do a lot with agriculture and various subsidies. And if a bunch of constituents, you know, rallied together and went to their representative and said, hey, we'd love if there were some subsidies for, you know, small organic farms that treat their animals really well, or some kind of alternative to the factory farm, that's something legislators will listen to. But I also think going directly to the company can be really helpful. You know, there's public campaigns, signing petitions, just voting with your wallet in terms of what you consume. And that all can be really important in terms of moving the needle. It's tough because we have seen several states enact what sometimes called in the community ag-gag laws. Basically, they're laws, yeah, I'm sure you've heard about this, in which
Oh yeah.
factory farms, yeah, I'm sure in the work that AWIP does, this comes up all the time, but factory farms are basically prohibiting any form of recording, any form of whistleblower activity or undercover investigations, which many believe not only violates the First Amendment, but also means that consumers aren't actually going to be able to see what's going on inside these farms. There's a real desire to kind of keep what's going on between those walls and not let the consumer witness it. And I think that's because these companies know that if the average person was able to see what was going on to make their hamburger or to their hot dog, they would definitely want to change. And actually, if you poll people, the vast majority of Americans, it's one of the like the least politicized issues of any issue. The vast majority of Americans want farmed animals to be treated well. It's not controversial. It's a big system that we're trying to shift a little bit for the better. So yeah.
I think like when I talk to people, because I get questions all the time about, labels on animal products, and people are so confused by this. And
Yeah.
unless you sit down and do your research, and it takes hours and hours and hours to really fully understand like what these labels do or don't mean, what the companies, want to convey to make consumers think may not be completely factual about what's happening on these farms and in these slaughterhouses. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the labeling of these products with you, um, because they're things like pasture raised and American humane, stuff like that. If you go into the grocery store, it can be very difficult to figure out, like, okay, I want to buy some eggs, but I want them to come from chickens that have been outside all the time with as much room as they want, and they're treated well, and they're not in these huts. If that's your consumer mindset, right? And then you go into the egg aisle and you see, well, these ones are cage free and these ones are pasture raised, and it's so confusing. Most people don't know what the difference is and what they mean. um so so Isabella, from like your perspective, your point of view, why do companies do this? Why do they have all these different kinds of labels? And if they're saying things like these are, inspected by third parties, does USDA, do these other entities, these third parties, do they actually go out and do these inspections at all?
Yeah, it's really a tough situation, and it really bothers me too because it feels like consumers are just being allowed to be misled. And most people are busy; they don't have time to. It's confusing even for me as a lawyer. And the more you research it, the more confusing it gets. People
Mhm.
just want to be able to shop and know that what they're buying, they're choosing to buy products from animals that live better lives and suffer less and are treated better. But the current system as it is really confusing. So if we look at the example of eggs, like we were talking about, so you have the label of cage free. Essentially, many eggs are raised by chickens in what are called battery cages, which are just very, very small cages that the chickens never leave, sometimes so small that they can't even extend their wings. They're crammed in with several other chickens. It's really unsanitary, and obviously, no one would want to spend their entire lives in a tiny cage. It's really bad. Um, so you would think that cage free would be a step up, and to a certain extent it is, and that the chickens are able to freely move. But what the egg carton doesn't tell you is that instead of being in cages, suddenly they're in these barns, but they're packed so tightly that each chicken has less than a sheet of printer paper of space to live their entire lives. In some sense, yes, they're not in a cage, but they are still caged because they live in dark barns with no sunlight, or they're pressed so close together that really they can't move. So then you think, okay, well, I won't buy cage free. What's next? You see free range. You think, wow, that sounds great. The chickens can range freely. That seems better. But actually, free range, which is inspected by the USDA, just like cage free is, only needs to refer to, it could be as small as like a tiny screened porch that is attached to one of these barns, that could be very small, rarely open. And because there are just so many chickens, millions of chickens, the chicken could spend their entire lives and never actually get into that porch area. And it certainly isn't outdoors. So, not in every case is that what free range means, but that's what it can mean, and that's what it usually means because that's what's the least expensive. So, the consumer is really being misled. If you ask them, well, what do you think cage free means, or what do you think free range means? They're not going to say, well, a tiny screened porch that most chickens can never even access because they're crammed so tight. So, of the three, if I were, at the supermarket and I was shopping for eggs, the one that I would look for that actually does mean something in terms of the welfare of the chicken is actually pasture raised, and that's not a certification that is done. I'm not sure if the USDA may have a version of it, but usually what you'll see is pasture raised, and then it'll be certified by a third party. Often you'll see certified humane, and that usually has some requirements that really do mean something in terms of the lives of the chickens. So it's something like they need to have 108 square feet of outdoor space. They need to be able to be on grass for a certain part of the year. And there are some other requirements that actually do mean that the chickens are having better lives. But it's just so frustrating because for the average person, if you saw free range and pasture raised, you'd probably think that was exactly the same thing or similar. What does it even mean? So in my personal opinion, I feel like the government really isn't doing enough in terms of regulating how companies are using these terms, and sometimes they're really actively misleading. Like you'll see on a crate, an egg crate, hormone free, and you think, oh, that's great, they're not being given hormones, that seems better. But actually they're not permitted to be given hormones. That's actually not something that's allowed for egg laying chickens. So just the companies bragging about something that they're legally required to do in the hopes that you'll spend extra on their product, when that's true for every egg that's sold. So it's a pretty tough system. But I would encourage consumers who buy eggs to think about pasture raised, certified humane. If they have a farmer's market, sometimes you can get, backyard eggs at a farmer's market, and the chickens, they're being raised well. And also, I do think that vegan products in the past several years have come a really long way. Just Egg does a really good egg replacement, and we're seeing amazing things with Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat. We're even seeing cool stuff with lab grown meat. So who knows? My hope is that decades from now, we might live in a world in which this problem that I'm talking about with you has been solved by technology, and we don't have to rely on the suffering of billions of sentient beings to, eat something delicious and
One
filling.
of one of the cool things I saw when I was at because so I buy pasture raised eggs, and I think it's, what is it, Vital Farms, I think,
Yeah.
is the company. So if you, this is not an endorsement. I'm not, I just want to explain that. So I went to the grocery store. I got these Vital Farms eggs because they said they were pasture raised. And I came home, and like inside of the carton, they have these like this code that you can go to on their website that's like hook up to a camera, and you can actually like log into this like live feed where you see the chickens like out in this huge, forested area, and they're just, running around. They look like happy chickens. So I thought
Yeah.
that was kind of interesting. I mean, I hope it's a live feed. I'm pretty sure it's a live feed, but
Yeah. That's
um
fantastic. And
it
a
was
lot of these,
cool.
yeah, it's really cool. And a lot of these companies also are emphasizing farmer welfare and the environment along with chicken welfare. So a lot of these companies that really focus on providing eggs that are really high quality in terms of animal welfare also will purchase from small farms, family farms, farms that employ like regenerative practices, so they're not stripping the earth of its nutrients and hurting the environment. So um, I definitely can empathize with the fact that groceries continue to become more expensive, and it is true that the higher welfare animal products do cost more, unfortunately. But I think that for consumers that can make that change, it has such an impact on the lives of animals and often the lives of workers and farmers as well. So it's one of the most impactful things you can do, and it's been encouraging because I think we've seen a real shift in the past 5 years, 10 years. I'm seeing a lot more pro animal welfare products in the supermarket. I'm seeing a lot more milk alternatives, plant-based alternatives, and that's really cool to see. So I think that we are seeing a big change in the American consumer, and that's wonderful.
So, for people who are not aware, I wanted to bring up a case involving Foster Farms. Foster Farms raises chickens. There was an investigation that went on just a few months ago. Actually, I want to say it was Animal Outlook had released this video of the cruelty to chickens that was going on in one of their houses. I think it was in Fresno, California, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and this video was, I mean, it was horrific. You see workers running over chickens with forklifts and not killing them, throwing them, kicking them, grabbing them by the wings and their necks. And I mean, it's hard to watch. I see some pretty bad stuff, and it was hard to watch. And um, after the release of this, their general counsel had released a statement because there was a lot of backlash that they were receiving from the public due to this video. And I want to read a quote from their general counsel that they released. So they said, keep in mind, this is a couple months ago. Foster Farms uncovered a few employees had intentionally violated our animal welfare and training standards and procedures. Per our zero tolerance policy, we immediately terminated those individuals and referred them to the Fresno County law enforcement, where they will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Put simply, the conduct was counter to everything we stand for as a company, and our actions ensure those responsible are held accountable. So, what they said that they were going to do in response to this video that was released was they had 5 points. So, they said that they were going to conduct immediate company-wide animal welfare retraining on all ranches and in all plants, expansion of its animal welfare team with the creation of a new role of chief animal welfare officer, the creation of additional animal welfare director roles on site covering each Foster Farms complex, increased frequency of animal welfare audits, particularly in live operations facilities, and increased professional animal auditor certification organization, or they call it PACO staff. Which sounds great to the average person, I think. But Isabella, do you think that these actions are enough to improve conditions on the farms? Do you think that that this is a reasonable reaction from the company? I just wonder, because to me, looking at the video and then seeing their reaction to me is more so because they got caught, not because they're actually interested in the welfare of it. Because if you were genuinely interested and you're like, we're going to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen, because this happens to these chicken companies all the time, or not just chickens, other industries who raise other animals, for food. But it always seems like it's a reaction to the release of an undercover investigative video that's then published to the public. You never see like companies being very, very transparent and showing, documents of what the conditions are like in their facilities. Um, unlike, you know, how I had mentioned, like the Vital Farms has the videos you can log in whenever you want and look at where, you know, your eggs came from. But they don't do that in these hen houses. They don't do these in slaughterhouses. You know, I don't really know anybody who would want to log in and look at a slaughterhouse in progress. But the point is, what what are your thoughts about their reaction to the release of the video?
Yeah, I think that our mission at Lick is to advocate for animal welfare. So I'm always happy to see any kind of commitment, you know, corporate commitment to animal welfare. But I think you raised a great point. And what came out of Foster Farms, you know, and we commissioned this undercover investigation, as you mentioned. The footage that emerged was really disturbing and unsettling. And so much of what goes on in modern industrial agriculture is really disturbing and unsettling, but this wasn't even an example of the sort of mm, everyday, kind of accepted, sort of customary violence and sort of animal suffering that occurs. This was really, in my opinion, personal opinion, really extreme, unnecessary, sadistic behavior. So the local sheriff's office has announced that they will be conducting they've assigned detectives. They're conducting an investigation of Foster Farms, which we at Lick were really happy to hear because we don't think this is an instance of, you know, quote unquote customary agricultural practices. To us, this seemed like, you know, uh, something more than that, something more egregious. So we're looking forward to hearing the results of that investigation when it's released.
Now, this was very, very recent, a couple days ago. And I know that you guys do work here in the US. I don't, you, Legal Impact, do you guys do work in other countries as well?
We haven't done work internationally that I'm aware of thus far, but it's, you know, obviously there's animal cruelty going on all over the world. So it's wonderful that, you know, we have ally organizations like AWIP that are doing sort of this international stuff because
Sure.
it's happening everywhere, not just here.
I just asked because a couple of days ago there was a case that the RSPCA and the Humane League in the UK
Mm-hmm.
had brought a case to their courts about the treatment of chickens, these broiler chickens, as they're referred to. And they had their parliament had passed this ban saying that you know they that these companies were not allowed to raise these fast growing chickens due to uh, the genetic conditions that cause them to suffer, which you explained earlier. You know, they get so big, their legs are broken, they have sores, they have, you know, heart conditions, all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't use the word like Franken chicken. I don't think I didn't read the entire judgment, but they said so they said that this was a significant impact in the legislation and treatment of these chickens over in the UK because these companies are not allowed to grow, um, breed these fast growing chickens, as they refer to them, anymore. And it's being hailed as uh, the biggest, most recent advancement in welfare for chickens over there, which I just thought was interesting. I didn't know if you guys had heard or read about that. Um, but
I hadn't, but that's so fantastic to hear.
yeah,
Because to me, there's something so tragic about the fact that, and you know, you see this with egg-laying hens, dairy, and cows and pigs as well. But there's something so tragic to me about the way that we bring into life these creatures who are inevitably going to live lives that are really full of suffering just because of the way they are genetically. You know, if you go to a animal sanctuary, it's really tough because the pigs, the chickens, the cows that are rescued, unfortunately live, lives that have a lot of pain in them, and the sanctuaries do their best to help, but they just were not meant to live past a certain lifespan. So they grow really large and their bodies aren't able to handle it. So I'm really happy to hear that, and I'm not surprised because the UK and Europe have really been leaders in terms of animal welfare, especially when compared to the United States. Another huge animal welfare issue that we haven't touched on is the culling of male chicks. So in the egg industry, male chicks are not economically useful. So unfortunately, as soon as they're born, they die. Millions of chicks every year, might be even billions, and sometimes they are, it's graphic but macerated. They're ground alive as babies as soon as they're born, and certain European countries, I know Italy, have made a commitment to try and promote sex selective in sort of in vitro fertilization with chickens, so that only female chicks are born and male chicks don't have to be killed in such a, to me, senseless and graphic way. So I would love if, we talked earlier about controlled atmospheric stunning. If we could take some of these laws that we're seeing in the UK and the European context and apply them in the United States, that would be so wonderful. And I'm hopeful we'll see some movement on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that, with America being America, and being typically thought of as world leaders in a lot of different areas, it's kind of sad that we fail so miserably in that aspect when it comes to animal welfare. And um, I think that over time, with more people getting educated on animal welfare standards, or just completely going vegetarian or vegan helps. And I think like making that push, continue to do that still, is really what we need, because in the end, like the most powerful influence to these companies and how they treat their animals is essentially comes down to the consumer. It's all about us and what we want and what we demand. And so, in that sense, it very much is the case that the people have the power to change this, would be what I would say. But
Absolutely.
I was gonna ask Isabella if whether you agreed with that, and then also, because I know we're running out of time here, if there was anything, any comments, anything else that you wanted to discuss or talk about before.
Yeah, of course. I totally agree with you. I'm completely on board with that. And also, I think just reminding people that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. If you consume a lot of meat in your life, you don't have to go vegan. You don't even have to go vegetarian. But even deciding, even just for personal health reasons, or if you're moved ethically by what these animals are going through, to say, hey, I'm not going to eat meat on Mondays, or hey, I'm going to try and get these pasture raised eggs, or get the beef from the farmers market, or pork from the farmers market that is raised at a small farm I know and trust. That will make a huge difference. And we've seen it at an institutional level. I know that in New York, the city administration recently passed, um, I think it was meatless Mondays at schools or at hospitals. And what's crazy is actually when you rated people's satisfaction with the food, most of them didn't even notice that it was plant based. And then they said it actually tasted way better and that they preferred it. So just small kind of nudges, if you make the default meal plant based, in a work context or at a conference, these things really add up, because the scale of how much we consume is just mind boggling. So if you make a change that causes, your workplace, or where you attend school, or even your family, to consume 10% fewer animal products or from more ethical sources, that's going to impact hundreds of animals or even thousands of animals, depending on scale. in any given year. So you've made a real change, and it's hard to think of an area that's as much like that, other than what we consume, because that's something we're doing 3 times a day and um, throughout the year. So that's a real place where we can make a real change, and um, there's something hopeful about that.
Well, Isabel, I just want to say thank you for coming on to the podcast. It was really it's I always love talking with lawyers. I think the work that you guys do is fantastic, and it's such a good cause behind it. So I just want to say thank you for talking with me and clarifying, a bunch of these different topics for our viewers. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so wonderful to talk with you, Ray, and the work that you guys are doing is really impressive. So thank you for everything you do for animals and for workers, and thank you.
And of course, to all of our viewers, make sure that you check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Spotify. We'll have these episodes posted up every Tuesday. And I just want to say thank you for all of your support as we continue throughout the year. We've had a lot of great feedback from everybody who seems to like these topics. So this wouldn't be possible without our viewers. So thank you to everyone, and we will see you next week.